Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Biological Fitness. So today we are going to do some work with the breath. And of course, breath has been mentioned in every one of the classes up to this point, right? Because as we are exploring movements, every time we make a movement, the quality of how we breathe as we move, it indicates something about the level of effort we're making, whether we're moving efficiently or whether we are over efforting. Most simply put, if we ever hold the breath, that's a sign of extra effort. And of course, it's a sign of extra effort at any moment during the day. It could happen because you suddenly get some news that's distressing to you, or you're startled by something and the breath, right? That's a moment where the body is responding to the stress by restricting the breath. And so, of course, this is something we want to develop an awareness of, not simply by attending a class like this one, but throughout the day, becoming more aware of the coming and going of the breath. So I couldn't have a class called Biological Fitness without focusing at some point in more detail on the breath. So that's what we're going to do today. And we will begin in a way that's going to feel like some fairly subtle, detailed work. And then you'll see that the movement is going to grow and become a little larger as we go on with the process. Some things that we're doing you'll be familiar with. We will be exploring habits, and in particular, biases you may have to the left and the right. Nothing to worry about. We're all asymmetrical, right? But we can study our asymmetries, including in breathing, as a way to improve our functioning. So that's one thing we will do. And what you will also find out is that working with the breath, although in the beginning it's very subtle, throughout the lesson, we will be changing the shape of the skeleton with the breath. And so we will be especially talking to all the joints along the spine where the ribs connect in, and of course in front where the ribs connect into the breastbone. All of those muscles in between the ribs can really be woken up by what we're doing, not to mention the connection between your head and the spine and your hip joints, which will also be affected by our process today. Okay, so that's just the basic overview of what we're going to do. As always, I like to invite folks to begin the lesson in standing. So that's where we'll start. But before you begin, just make sure that you have a place to set up on the floor. Okay, and we can get started. So please come to stand. Just take a moment here to be quiet before we get to the specific inquiry of this awareness through movement lesson. Just notice what you notice. What details of your experience are in the foreground for you right now? And we are working with the breath today. So whatever else you're noticing, include the breath. And the breath has many different qualities to it. So you can notice the rhythm of your breathing. More specifically, you might notice which takes longer, your inhale or your exhale. Do they seem approximately even? As you take in a breath, do you breathe through your mouth? Do you breathe through your nose? Do you take in more air through one side of the nose? And how do you change your shape internally with each breath? What is the sound of you breathing? And now if you shift your weight over one leg, how does that impact your breathing? So you don't have to lift a foot off the floor, but if you bring most of your weight over one leg, just notice, do you breathe more into one side of your chest than the other? Come back to the middle. Notice how it is to breathe in the middle and then go over the other leg. And you might notice that it's actually easier to breathe over one leg. Now, I can't say for sure, but I'm going to guess that if you breathe better over one leg, that's also the leg where you feel more stable. And there's a simple relationship between your breathing, the state of your musculature, and your balance, which is worth understanding. And so this relates to why you might feel different breathing balanced over one leg or the other. But let's do a little experiment to make it very clear. So if you just come back to the middle, listen to your breathing, and pay attention to the area of your waist, your low belly. Feel your breathing there, feel the movement, and then begin to lean forward and actually lean a little bit too far so you feel that maybe your toes begin to kind of grip the floor so you won't fall. And notice what happens to your breathing. Come back to the middle, and you'll see, oh, okay, the breath is restored, right? But if you think about the possibility that you could expand in the area of your belly to the front, to the back, and to the sides, when you lean forward like that, again, just notice, where do you feel some contraction of the musculatures? Is it in the front? Is it in the back? Wherever you clench, that place will no longer be available for the movement of your breathing. So you can try a similar thing if you rock a little back on your heels. Don't do it too quickly, but if you go a little too far back, you'll find that you're in a place that's unstable. And again, you'll feel that you begin to grip somewhere in your body, right? And this impacts your breathing. And then when you come back to more of a centered place, you'll see, oh, okay, I can let go of that extra work. So ideally, when you're upright, the bulk of the work of keeping you upright is done by your skeleton. Now, there are muscles that are working all the time to keep you upright, but then there are other muscles that shouldn't have to work, but will be called into play if you begin to fall. And when I say fall, I don't mean that you actually stumble, but for example, now if you allow your head to sort of dip off to one side or maybe just falls forward in front of your spine, you'll see the head is no longer supported over the spine. And again, somewhere you're going to have to clench. And this is going to change your breathing. Or if you bring your head back up on top of your spine, but then you just roll one of your feet a little inwards so that you sort of come to the inner edge of your foot and you don't have a clear support with the ground. This too will change the quality of your breathing. Okay. And that was just a little demonstration of something that I think you'll be able to feel with much greater clarity after the process of what we're going to do. But that's a little bit of a framing for why we want to study the way that the breath moves, in particular through the ribs in our class today. So come and lie on your back on the floor. And if it's comfortable for you, have the legs long. Otherwise, you're welcome to bend your knees and stand your feet. As soon as you find yourself on the floor, just tune in again to your internal sensation and the movement of the breath. And see if you can remember some of your experience of shifting over one leg to breathe and over the other, and whether it felt noticeably different for you, left to right. And then notice the sensation of the two sides of your body as you lie on the floor. Does it feel like one side of the body lets go more fully? And do you notice that the breath seems to expand more easily on one side of the spine? Pull your head gently a little left and right. And then bring your head to the middle. Listen to the coming and going of your breath. Listen to the come and going of your breath. And then the next time you breathe out, pause. Don't breathe in right away. Just wait a few extra seconds and then allow the air to come in. And keep doing that. After each exhale, pause. And so maybe you get a little sense of a buildup of pressure and then you allow the air back in. But you're looking for a feeling that the breath comes in a way that it's as if you were passive. There's really no need to make a specific effort to suck in the air. So just exhale and wait. But try to imagine the flow of the air coming in. And then pay attention to the whole area between your pelvis and your head. When the air comes in and you feel an internal expansion to make room for the breath, where does it feel like that expansion begins? To expand in the belly, to expand in the chest, to expand more to one side. Does the expansion change your relationship to the floor? And as you continue to pay attention, notice particularly the area of your low back. And at the very bottom of your rib cage, the last two ribs on each side are called the floating ribs. The reason they're called that is that unlike the rest of your ribs, they don't wrap all the way around from the spine to connect to the breastbone in front. They're just like these little wings coming out of your spine right at the bottom of your rib cage. And so whether or not you can feel specifically those ribs, you can imagine that area of your low back. And just notice each time you exhale and then wait, and then the air comes in. In that area of your low back, does it feel like the floating ribs are moving? It's easy to feel that your belly, your chest, and the front change shape with the breathing. But try to listen to what's probably a much more subtle movement in the low back. And even if it's a small movement, try to determine for yourself if it feels like the floating ribs are moving away from the floor, if they're lifting and creating a little more space there, or do they press back towards the floor? And what you notice here, it might have something to do with your habits of how you are in the world when you're upright. You remember you were experimenting and you found out that if you kind of tip off of your gravitational center, different muscles in your body will come into the rescue and they will contract. And for some of us, we have habits of our upright action that basically involve contracting some muscles all the time. And some of that lets go when you lie down on the floor, but some of that is so habitual that it's still taking place. And so we're going to begin to play with some subtle movements here of the floating ribs. And I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised at the large impact that these small movements can have. So each time you breathe in now, deliberately lift the floating ribs a little bit away from the floor. Now I'm emphasizing a little bit because you might not be used to making intentional movements with the floating ribs. So just imagine that space of your low back, and as the breath comes in, just have an image of creating a tiny bit more space between your back and the floor, right at the bottom of your ribs on the back side. You don't want to try to make some huge arch in your back there, just enough to know that you're not moving towards the floor, you're moving away. And let go each time you breathe out. So just make the movement on the inhale. And as you continue to do that, notice specifically how you do that on the right side and how you do that on the left side. So you might notice that the floating ribs seem to lift more simply on one side. Perhaps one side lifts before the other. So now, which side would it be easier for you to lift if you were to just focus on one side? So do that now. You pick left or right, but don't worry about the floating ribs on the other side. Just breathe in and lift on one side, a little bit away from the floor. And what you're doing here is, first, by just paying attention to the two sides, you've identified a little bit of a bias or a habit that you have, and now you are exaggerating that habit. So it's not just movement in the sense of exercise, but you're now highlighting for your brain what that pattern is. Right? And each time you lift the floating ribs on one side, you might be able to feel that that subtle movement, it actually ripples through you. So you might feel a slight shift in the pressure on the back of your pelvis or the muscle tone in your legs. You might feel changes higher up in your chest with this movement. And now shift your attention over to the floating ribs on the other side and begin to invite the movement on the other side. And you might find that what happens doesn't feel equal to the movement you were just doing. So don't worry about that. Just again, be sure that on the second side now, the floating ribs are moving away from the floor rather than toward the floor. And aside from that, the movement can be as small as you like. What's important is that you keep the movement within a range that's comfortable and that you can still breathe simply. And what you may find is that if you just take your time with it, it gets a little easier as you go along. But maybe it's still not quite equal to what happened on the first side. So now with each inhale, change which side you lift the floating ribs. Make the movement once on the right and once on the left. And as you alternate, pay attention to the quality of these two movements. And if one of them is much easier than the other, make that easier movement a little smaller. So if you'd like the two sides to function a little more similarly, rather than making an extra effort on the side where there's some challenge, just reduce the size of the movement where you find it's a little easier. And now with each in-breath, go back to lifting the floating ribs on the left and the right. Just see if it's maybe slightly more symmetrical than it was when you began. And then take a little bit of a rest. Obviously, continue breathing, just briefly letting go of the specific thing we were doing. Come right back to it. Just notice how you feel resting on the floor after that first little exploration. And then, as you did before, breathe out, wait, allow the air to come in, and as it does, you lift the floating ribs on the left and the right. And keep doing that, but now instead of putting your attention in the low back, notice how the movement of the floating ribs changes the organization of the front of your chest. So in particular, notice your breastbone. If you like, you can put your fingers on your breastbone. Maybe feel the collarbones that connect to the top of each shoulder and trace them to the middle and find the top of your breastbone at the base of your throat. And just rest your fingers lightly, fingers of each hand on the breastbone. If you can, keep your elbows on the floor or just find a way for your arms to be restful here. And just notice every time you breathe in and lift the floating ribs from the floor, does your breastbone move towards your head? Or does it move down towards your feet? Well, perhaps it feels like your breastbone doesn't move at all. Try breathing and lifting the floating ribs once or twice without allowing the breastbone to move. Now, that's not a recommendation for you to employ that strategy as a regular thing, but you can see the consequences right away if the breastbone is frozen, right? So give your breastbone permission to move. And again, just notice when the floating ribs lift from the floor, does the breastbone want to go towards your head or towards your feet? And if you can get clearer about that, I'll ask you now to make the same movement you're making, except rather than thinking of lifting the floating ribs, begin the movement with a sliding of the breastbone. So again, which way do you slide it if you want to create that movement of lifting the floating ribs from the floor? If you're not sure, just try making one movement of breathing in and sliding the breastbone upwards or sliding it downwards. And this is, again, it's not a large movement. If you need to, you can use the fingers to help to guide your breastbone. Figure out which direction it would be, and then continue to make the movement and feel that the floating ribs lift more passively than they did before. And then with the next breath, go back to beginning the movement with the floating ribs. And the breath after that, initiate from the breastbone. So now you're alternating where you're placing your attention and where you're initiating the movement. Once in the low back, and then with the next movement from the top of your chest. And notice if it feels simpler for you to make one of these two movements. Okay, and now just leave everything alone. Just notice how your breath settles. And now exhale and wait. And when the air comes in, this time press the floating ribs back towards the floor. And keep doing that. And once again, begin to pay attention to see if there's a slight difference between how you do this movement on the left and on the right. And once again, same idea, begin to press the floating ribs back on one side. Just choose the side where the movement feels clearer. And again, notice how that asymmetry shows up elsewhere in your body. If you press the floating ribs back on one side, you're inviting a subtle rotation of the torso. See if you can feel how maybe there's a little more pressure going into the floor on one side of the low back when you do that. And then switch over to the other side. And then breathe in and press the floating ribs back once on the right. And with the next inhale, you press the floating ribs back on the left. And there's a way that if you just do this, you just alternate left and right, your body will look for a more of an equal effort. But it's also to your benefit to really be specific in your attention. What sensations show up when you make the movement on the left that don't show up when you make the movement on the right? Or show up on the right but not on the left? Just get really curious about those subtleties. And then press the floating ribs back on both sides again. And like before, when you were lifting the floating ribs, now that you're pressing the floating ribs back, what does the breastbone do? So these movements, they actually imply a movement of the entire thoracic cage, right? The entire rib cage. So begin to initiate the movement from your breastbone. Again, if you'd like to use your hands to help, you can do that, but you might not need to do that. And it's not a large movement, but again, do you take the breastbone up towards your head or down towards your feet in order to cause the floating ribs now passively to move backwards towards the floor? All the movements are done on the inhalation, so just let go when you exhale. So alternate, begin the movement with the floating ribs, and the breastbone, back and forth. Here too, notice if there's differences in sensation with these two different strategies of making a movement. And then let go. And now put together these two ideas. So breathe in and lift the floating ribs from the floor. And then on the very next in-breath, press the floating ribs back into the floor. And as you continue to do this, listen to the entire length of your spine. Notice if there's a change with these movements in the distance between your chin and your chest. If there's a subtle rocking of your head, which changes the point of contact on the back of your skull. And listen down into your hip joints and the connection of the back of your pelvis with the floor. If you like, you can bend your knees and stand your feet, and that might clarify these connections for you. So try a few movements with the feet standing if you had the legs long. Once again, breathing in to lift the floating ribs, and then with the next breath, pressing the floating ribs back into the floor. And then just to really just bring home this idea, because you're also building an image for yourself here, make those same two movements, but do it by once thinking of drawing the breastbone up in the direction of your head. And then with the next inhalation, sliding it down in the direction of your feet. And so you can't make these movements without involving the joints all along your spine. So they might not be large movements, but look for this movement that's passing along your length. Okay, and now take a rest. If you like, you can lengthen your legs on the floor again. And now we might move a little more quickly here, but basically we're going to repeat this process again, except we're going to time the movements with the exhalation. Now that might not seem like a big difference, but of course the shape of your chest when it's filled with air or when the lungs are mostly emptied out, they never get completely emptied of air. But those two different shapes are indeed different, and the flow of air is moving in a different direction. So coordinating these movements in a different rhythm to your breathing, as you've seen in some of the previous awareness through movement lessons in this series, it is yet another variation that is meaningful for your nervous system. So now as you exhale, press the floating ribs back into the floor. Keep doing that on each new exhale. When you inhale, just allow your body to return to whatever place it seems to want to naturally go. Press the floating ribs back again with every exhale, and then begin to explore a few movements on the right, a few movements on the left, and not simply kind of following the instructions to say, I did it, but using the exploration of the two sides of your low back as a way of discovering subtleties or sometimes differences that aren't so subtle between the two sides. When do you breathe better? When you make the movement on the right or when you make the movement on the left? And then make the movement on both sides again and begin to track the movement also on the front with your breastbone. And alternate with each exhale between initiating from your chest in front and then back to your low back. And leave that alone. And then, of course, come back to the exhale, but this time lifting the floating ribs from the floor. And do you remember by now the way this process works? How do you take this simple action and investigate the way it shows up on the two sides, and then go back and forth as a way of maybe creating a little more balance, and then eventually investigate the relationship between the movement in the low back and the front of your chest. So hopefully it's all quite familiar by now, but as you go along, you may feel that the reverberations of these smaller movements are getting clearer from head to toe. And now each time you breathe out, alternate between those two movements again. On the exhale, once lift the floating ribs from the floor, and then with the next exhale, press the floating ribs back into the floor. And then breathe out as you move the breastbone down, away from the head in the direction of your feet, and then move it up with the next exhale, back and forth. And by now, maybe you can have a sense of what's going on in the front and the back at the same time. Maybe you can think of generating the movements from both places. Right? Just notice now if there's a clearer movement of the head, the pelvis that begins to come in. And let it all go. Take another rest. Now, at this point, if you would like, you might decide to roll onto one side just to change your position for a few moments. It's fine, or you can continue to rest on your back. So we're going to begin to look at the movements of the torso as you breathe in a couple of different ways now. When you're ready, come to your back. And pay attention to the breastbone again. And watch what it does when you breathe in. How does it move in relation to the floor and the ceiling? And also, what do you feel happening internally in the space between your breastbone and your spine and back? So now make a movement. Again, the size of the movement isn't important, but be clear on the directions so that when you breathe in, you take your breastbone directly forward towards the ceiling. Now, this shouldn't mean that you lift the spine from the floor. But if you take the breastbone a little bit forward, it's like there was a handle on your breastbone, like on a suitcase, and someone had just grabbed a hold of it and just began to lift as the breath came in. Although you don't lift your spine from the floor, you may feel that the way your back meets the floor changes. And now, with each breath, think of flattening the breastbone so it moves back towards the floor. And notice how this changes the entire shape of your chest. What do you feel in your armpits when you do that? What happens to the pressure between your shoulder blades and the floor? So now alternate with each in-breath between moving the breastbone forward towards the ceiling, and then with the next in-breath backwards towards the floor. And as you go between these two movements, pay attention to the feeling of your shoulder blades on the floor and try to sense the space between your shoulder blades. And notice if it's getting a little wider and a little narrower as you move the breastbone It's two different movements towards and away from the ceiling. Which movement makes your back feel wider? Which movement makes your back feel narrower? Take a pause for a moment. And then try out those same movements, except on the exhalations. And throughout what we're doing here, you're probably finding that some movements feel simpler when you're breathing in. Some movements feel simpler when you're breathing out. So that's fine. But what you want to do is dip your toes in the water of each of these different combinations and possibilities to broaden the overall vocabulary of sensations that your body gets to experience. And let it all go. And now, if your legs were long, bend your knees and stand your feet. And now, with each in-breath, invite the air to move downwards and invite an expansion into your belly. With each breath, invite the expansion to go lower, down below your belly button, as if to fill the as if to fill the bowl of your pelvis. And just notice when you do that, when you expand your belly, which, by the way, doesn't mean lifting your low back from the floor. You should be able to leave your low back connected to the floor, or if there is an arching, you can minimize it. You're just looking to soften the muscles in your low belly and invite that expansion. But notice what happens with your chest. How does this change the shape of your chest? What does your breastbone do? And is there a movement along the spine? Is there a change in the pressure on the back of your pelvis, the back of your head? Now, with each new breath, draw your belly up and in under the lowest ribs. And notice how this changes the shape of your chest. And feel your chest can expand when the belly is pulled in. And now, with one breath, expand the belly. You'll feel that the chest flattens, and then draw the belly up and in to expand the chest. As you continue to do this, the movement up and down along the length of your spine is probably a lot clearer. These are larger movements than what you were doing earlier. Okay, take a rest. And then once again, draw in a breath and fill your belly, and now hold the breath. And with your breath held, then draw your belly in and push your belly out, and draw it in and push it out. Do that a number of times, but take another breath when you need to. So don't hold the breath for an uncomfortable length of time. But once you are ready, again, draw the breath in and hold it. And just change the shape of your torso in this way. Expand the belly, expand the chest, expand the belly, expand the chest, and feel the movement up and down your spine. Think of all those little joints. You're getting some nice, nutritious movement as you do this. Okay, let the breath flow again. But now try holding the breath after the exhale. And again, making these same movements of expanding the belly, expanding the chest, expanding the belly, expanding the chest. And you see, because the breath is held, that these movements don't actually depend on the movement of the air. And then just allow your breath to flow again. Let's see if there's a lot more availability now in the ribs, in the spine, to move even with this resting breath. Now you can play with this movement in a similar way to what you were doing earlier and investigate some asymmetrical possibilities. So now breathe in, hold the breath, and move the shape from the left side of your belly to the right side of your chest on the diagonal. And feel this diagonal movement along the floor as well, from your left hip to your right shoulder blade. Try that 2 or 3 times. And then begin to explore a movement from your left shoulder down to your right hip. So you can feel the movement along the front. Pay attention also to the movement along the floor, how this impacts your pelvis, your head, and then make one movement of holding the breath and going back and forth a few times on one diagonal, and then the next time you draw and hold the breath, go to the other diagonal. And then move once again up and down the middle. And see if after these many repetitions, it's possible for the movement to be a little lighter and maybe a little faster. Now, if this is your first time trying this, it's just going to be what it is, right? That's fine. But with practice, you can make this quite smooth. You can almost get a sense of moving your torso like as if you were filled with jelly, kind of just oscillating up and down with this internal movement. It can be a nice thing to find. Wherever you're at with it now, that's fine. Just let it go. Lengthen your legs and take a rest. And roll your head a little left and right. Notice if the feeling in your neck compared to the beginning of this process has changed at all from these movements. Bring your head back to the middle. And now imagine that you were wearing a belt. And as you breathe in, invite the expansion to go as low as you can, down towards the pelvic floor, low belly, somewhere in that region. And if you were wearing a belt, look for a sense of expansion where you would feel your body pressing along the inside of the belt all the way around. Look for that movement as far down away from your head as you can find it. Just keep inviting that for the next several breaths. And now just imagine that you slid that belt 1 inch higher up. So again, breathe as if you were breathing into this ring-like shape, but a little higher up for a few breaths, and then move it again, 1 or 2 inches higher. And what you're doing here, you might not know how you're doing it. It really is about having a certain image and a certain intention. So sometimes you might get a sensation that feels like you're kind of getting what you wanted a little more specifically, and other times you're not sure. That's fine. Just stay with the process, move the belt, the imaginary belt, a little higher. Maybe you're somewhere in the area of your lower ribs now. After a few breaths, again, move it a little higher. And of course, the breath moves through other places, but You just see what happens if you have the intention in that one particular place and move the ring a little bit higher. Maybe you're in the middle of your chest now, or even up somewhere near your armpits. And now imagine you breathe again into the lowest ring. But rather than just breathing into that ring, as the exhale continues, imagine that the ring moves upwards towards your head, that it ripples upwards, but it still continues to expand all the way around. So you breathe in to the lowest ring, but as soon as the lungs begin to fill, it's as if the ring the ring moves upwards through your belly, through your chest, to the level of your armpits. You can even imagine it passes through your throat and up through the top of your head. With each inhalation. And then you can actually play with the idea that this ring moves downwards when you breathe out. So the in-breath, it rises up, and the out-breath, it goes down. And since it's just an image, if you like, move the rings all the way down to your feet on the exhale. Just see how this image invites a rippling from head to toe. And now this might be a little bit of a strange sensation, but can you change the direction of the movement of the rings? Imagine that you breathe in to move the ring down. And then as you exhale, it moves from your feet back up towards your head. Okay, let go of the rings and just see how your breath moves on its own. And if you remember when you first lay down on the floor, I asked you to try to sense where is that single point inside of you that is at the center of the expansion with each new breath. Where do you locate it now? And so imagine that you breathe into that single point, but then as the breath continues, that like a balloon, it expands outwards in every direction. And you can play with this image in such a way that you imagine the expansion goes beyond your body. It goes out to the entire room. Or maybe it even expands out beyond that. It can expand infinitely in every direction. Imagination is a beautiful thing. So invite that from that single point, an infinite expansion to the left, to the right, forward, back, up, and down. And then as you breathe out, imagine it's like you draw the whole universe back into that single point as you breathe out. And then as you breathe in, again, expanding outwards in all directions. And then just to show you, once again, what your imagination can do, change this around. Breathe in to draw everything into that single point and expand outwards as you exhale. And then once again, expand outwards on the inhale and draw into that single point as you breathe out. Okay, and now just let go of everything and feel how you rest on the floor. What's your internal image now of your ribs, your spine? Can you feel how the skeleton is moved by the breath? It's even worth noticing, what's your state of mind? What does it feel like throughout your being to breathe this way? And now bend your knees and stand your feet. And take all the time you need here to transition up off from the floor. But as you go, continue paying attention to the breathing. Especially when you raise the pelvis off the floor, or when you begin to take one of your knees up off the floor and eventually come up into standing. At every point along the way, do you maintain an even breath, or do you find that the breath is held or restricted at some moment? If that happens, it's no worry, but that's a little signal to you that maybe there was something in your balance, some way that you were organizing the movement that potentially there's room for improvement. But come to standing now. And just feel, how do you relate to the surrounding space? It's possible after a process like this that you might actually feel like you're a little bigger. Or who knows, maybe you feel smaller. Just notice, how do you command the space? And can you sense an internal movement with your breathing that has the potential now to move in every direction? Left, right, forward, back, up and down. Can you feel the movement of your floating ribs just as you stand and breathe? And can you feel in the soles of your feet that something is different when you're breathing in, when you're breathing out? And now remember the experiment you did before you got down on the floor in the beginning. You were leaning a little too far forward or back. But if you go back to that now, find out what is the smallest amount of movement you could make where you would notice the change in your breathing. So you lean forward or you lean back and you go a little too far. And you maybe feel, okay, that's where the breath restricts, but then come back to the middle and try doing it again, going even more gradually. So you can begin to notice how subtle a movement will influence the breathing. The breathing is a very, very finely tuned instrument that is always signaling the overall state of your effort. So another thing we tried at the beginning was to just roll one of the ankles a little inwards. But there too, you don't necessarily have to do it egregiously, just the tiniest bit. And notice where in your waist or in your ribs do you feel something tighten that even just to the tiniest degree restricts the breath. And then when you plant your foot clearly again, notice what is able to move with the breath once again. So that same subtlety that you can notice here in this moment, it's always there. And in the upcoming sessions, while we might not be as focused for the whole time directly on the breath, this relationship between your breath and everything else you do will continue to be a vital tool in the toolkit going forward. So we'll stop here from today. You might just want to take another 5 or 10 minutes before you jump into some other activity, just to continue to listen to the sensations that you found in this class. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.